Joining us this noon hour here. I am Phil Brink. I'm the consulting coordinator of Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Water Network, and I'm joined by with Sarah Didrikson. Sarah is with CCA, and she is helping to make this webinar go smoothly. Today, we're going to be talking with Liz Chandler and Professor Ryan Bailey about the results of a hydrologic study in the White River Basin around Meeker. This study looks at how water moves through the middle of the watershed and the role flood irrigation plays in sustaining stream flow during irrigation and post-irrigation months. So we're going to be covering the why of why the study was conducted, as well as how it was conducted. And then finally, we'll look at what the findings were. Our first speaker is Liz Chandler. Liz is the Watershed Coordinator for the White River Integrated Water Initiative, which is directed by the White River and Douglas Creek Conservation Districts. Liz has been involved in irrigated ag her entire life, and she is going to introduce the study and explain why it was needed. Our second speaker is Ryan Bailey. He is a professor in CSU's Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Ryan has done a lot of hydrologic modeling, especially in the Arkansas River Basin, looking at water supplies and water quality. So he brought a lot of knowledge and experience to this study. Before we begin, just a couple of notes. Please stay muted unless you want to ask a question. If you do have a question during the presentations, you can unmute and ask, or you can put your question in the chat. And we will also open it up for Q&A at the conclusion of the presentations. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on our webinar on our webpage at agwaternetwork.org, along with the highlights of the webinar. Okay, so we'll get rolling now. Liz, welcome.
Thank you.
Can
Thank
you
you all
shed some light?
for joining on the webinar. I am the Watershed Coordinator for the White River Integrated Water Initiative, which is overseen by the White River and Douglas Creek Conservation Districts over in Rio Blanco County. The initiative is a community collaborative that is run by 15 different groups that represent the entire geographical area of Rio Blanco County and represent environmental, agricultural, municipal, and industrial water interests. So when this group got together, we understood that the hydrology in the White River has declined by approximately 20% over the last 25 years. We recognize that the water use in the area is relatively junior by Colorado water rights. So there's a lot of concern about what the future looks like. What happens if people change how they're using water, or there's downstream calls that we have to answer? So we thought the best place to start would be to understand the relationship between the uses of water now and the water in the White River. Now that's the motivation for the study, is to understand what's going on now so that we have data that when people are looking at making future management decisions, they have data to go on and will understand the impact of those decisions on the flow levels in the White River. So to do that, we were lucky to find Dr. Bailey, and we wanted to construct a water model that will explain what will model what is going on right now with the water, and then use that to run scenarios so when people are making management decisions, they can make informed decisions on their water use. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bailey.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So Ryan, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Okay, can you see that, Phil?
Not yet. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
And whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure to show some results that we've been working on really the last 2 years, but the last year we've gotten some I could say major results that we'd like to share with everybody. Before I start, I'd like to have some acknowledgments. Of course, Liz Chandler, who just spoke, has just been instrumental in providing coordination of field work and field data. And we'll talk more about some of that data later on, but just a great great colleague to work with. And also the Colorado Water Conservation Board. The field work for this was provided through Colorado River District, and Liz was handling that side of it. But for the modeling, we needed some funding for CSU, and we wrote a couple of grants to the Colorado Water Conservation Board. So very grateful to them for providing funding for the modeling part of this project. I'm going to have four main outline statements for this presentation. First, we'll talk about the problem statement, and then talk about insights from field data, and then transition and talk about the hydrologic model, and then finally look at some scenarios that we've been looking at using our modeling approach. So the problem statement, this is very, very common in Western United States, semi-arid regions where we have flood irrigation. And so we have our river segment here, and we have a set of fields that we want to irrigate. And a ditch will provide that water through a ditch diversion. So water goes from diversion into the ditch. A portion of that water will seep into the aquifer. Often that's 10 to 20% of all ditch water goes to the aquifer. The remainder will be applied as flood irrigation to the fields. Of course, it's going to have some crop evapotranspiration. It's going to grow the grass or alfalfa. And a portion of that will run off the field as tailwater. But most of it in flood irrigation is actually going to be quote unquote lost or provided as deep percolation to the aquifer. And then that groundwater will slowly make its way back to the river as groundwater return flow or groundwater discharge. So that is a very common aspect of these irrigated alluvial valleys. Now here on the right, I'm showing a cross section of this conceptual system where we have our aquifer in connection with the river stream, and the dotted blue line is the water table. And in the spring and summer in these systems, we're going to have water coming in through ditch seepage and deep percolation that's going to raise the water table, which will then in turn raise or increase the groundwater gradients and induce groundwater flow towards the river. And so we have this these arrows depicting the flow of groundwater, and then in the fall winter that can sustain stream flow during those months, so in the post-irrigation months. So some questions that we have, how much groundwater discharges to the White River for these groundwater return flows? When and where does this happen? And how do these discharge amounts compare to other components? For example, volumes of diversion water, crop ET, evapotranspiration, ditch seepage, et cetera. So trying to compare the magnitudes of these different fluxes in the system. And another question we have is if this flood-dominated system was switched to sprinkler, what might happen to the magnitude and timing of these groundwater return flows to the river? And then what would happen to river flow in the fall and winter months if you no longer have that deep percolation and that's building up the groundwater storage that then drives the groundwater back to the river? Now, I should mention that these questions have been asked in other parts of the United States and also the world. What happens if you switch to from flood to sprinkler? And so the results I'm going to show today are very, at least generally are very common, what you would see in these systems. However, with the White River, we'll have some specific results just for the White River Valley. So what we want to know, and here's a picture of the White River Valley around the Meeker area. The blue line is showing the White River, and then the green areas, of course, are the irrigated regions. How much groundwater enters the White River? Where and when does this occur? How do ditch diversions and groundwater return flows affect stream flow in the White River? What happens to groundwater return flows and the timing of stream flow if flood irrigation is converted to sprinkler? And what might happen if there's an administrative call on the river, for example, during a drought year, or if river flows continue to decline in the future? And these white arrows are depicting, at least before we started the study, what we thought the direction of groundwater flow would be. So those fields get irrigated, excess water percolates below the root zone, recharges the aquifer, and then slowly makes its way back to the river. And again, another cross-section plot showing what we thought was happening with these high water tables driving groundwater into the river. Another conceptual system here just showing cross sections. So the upper part of this plot is showing spring and summer. So we have our canal, we have a ditch or a canal, and we're going to have some seepage from that that's going to raise the water table and induce groundwater flow and groundwater discharge. And then, of course, we have irrigation that's going to be provided by those ditches, and a little bit of rainfall as well. And then a lot of that's going to percolate past the root zone and add groundwater to the aquifer and raise the water table. There's also a little bit of pumping around so Meeker has a set of pumping wells. Those are actually in terms of volume, they're very small compared to irrigation and other like ditch seepage in the system. So the red arrow is showing the resulting increase in water table because of that deep percolation, because of the seepage, and a little bit of local decline in water table because of pumping. Again, not a big component of the hydrology, at least in the Meeker area. So that's spring and summer, and now in the fall, we now have a higher water table because of all that excess water that recharged the aquifer. We have groundwater flow and groundwater discharge to the White River. And the question is, are they persistent? How long do those last? What's the magnitude of those flows and like CFS compared to ditch diversions and irrigation? And so we had some question marks, and that's why we wanted to do the study, is to be able to quantify this for the Meeker area. A few weeks ago, I visited Meeker, and Liz and I went out and took some pictures with a local landowner, and just wanted to show you some of the basic, just some pictures showing the hydrology. So the map here is showing in green all the alluvial aquifer in the Agency Park and Powell Park aquifers along the White River. The black dots we're going to talk about later on. Those are locations of monitoring wells where we're actually tracking water table elevation through time. And the picture on the right is the White River just before Coal Creek comes in on the east side of the basin, or of this valley. I want to show a couple pictures of some of these tributaries. So Coal Creek feeds the White River, and the picture here upper right is showing kind of the native flow of Coal Creek before any irrigation happens. And this next picture is showing right before it goes into the White River. And as you can see, a lot higher flows. And this was taken on the same day, just like 10 minutes apart as we drove from one location to another. And there's a lot more flow because we're getting this return flow from groundwater as the fields are irrigated with flood irrigation, and then a lot of that percolates and goes to the aquifer and goes back. At least here it's in the Coal Creek. So not only do we have the White River that could be gaining water from groundwater and return flows, also the tributaries have the same process happening. So another picture here, there's some hill slopes here that's actually seeping water, and then it collects, and then it goes into the White River. And so you have these springs that form as the groundwater seeps out of the hillsides and collects and eventually goes into the river. And then Flat Creek is another tributary where it's gaining the flow showing here. Again, this is really low because it was just at the end of May, which this will go a lot higher during the summer months as more irrigation happens. But this is all just collecting groundwater return flow as it's coming off the fields. So we really, here on the upper left, I just show you a very simple diagram of what is happening in the valley. And so we have the White River there shown on the right. The dark blue lines are the water table. And you can see there on the left, you have kind of like this hill slope. And we have both kind of on this bench area, and then the floodplain and in lower areas, seepage from ditches, irrigation, and partially some of that water from the aquifer is going to be seeped out of the side of springs that will collect, eventually make its way back to the river, or be reused by ditches. And then also along the White River and tributaries, you're going to have direct inflow through the riverbed sediments. And so when the water gets diverted off, from the river, it's really just saturating the landscape, and then that water either can get reused by other downgradient ditches, but eventually makes its way back to the White River. So I'd like to now move on to some insights from field data that's been collected. And there's two aspects to this. One is a river water balance, and then the second is groundwater monitoring through monitoring wells. So we'll first start with the river water balance. We really want to figure out how much groundwater is moving from the aquifer into the White River along different sections of the river. So we're going to use river flow data to estimate groundwater discharge. Again, we're not doing any modeling yet. This is just looking at actual data. So here's a map of the Meeker area, and we have the Agency Park and Powell Park aquifers. The yellow polygons are the irrigated fields, and the black dots along the river are ditch diversions. So along this, it's about a 33-mile stretch of the river. There are 30 ditches. Of course, some are higher volume than others. You also notice there are 4 orange dots along the river from upstream to downstream, and those are gauge sites where daily stream flow is being measured either through the U.S. Geological Survey or the Colorado Department of Water Resources. So we're going to have 3 different sections. Each section is bracketed by 2 gauges. So section 1 goes from the first gauge to the second gauge, those 2 orange dots. Section 2 goes from the second gauge to the third gauge, and section 3 goes from the third gauge to the fourth gauge. Now, we're going to take each of those sections and perform a water balance on looking at inflows and outflows along the river and be able to kind of back out how much groundwater is coming in. So basically, looking at a river water balance, this is looking at, for example, one of those sections, looking at a simple diagram. We're going to have inflow and outflow just along that's just river flow. Then we also have diversion, so that's water that's being removed from the river. We also have daily measurements of that diversion water. We have tributaries coming in. Now, these historically have not been measured. Liz, in the last couple of years, has gone out and done weekly or biweekly spot flow measurements, so we do have some idea of the tributary water coming in. And then we also have along the entire reach groundwater being exchanged, or water being exchanged between the river and the aquifer. And again, we assume that mainly it's what's called a gaining stream. It's gaining water from the aquifer, as that upper diagram is showing. But we have all along the length, we have this kind of diffuse flow of groundwater coming into the river. So what we want to do is just do some accounting. So we're going to look at all the inflows and outflows. So outflow is equal to the inflow plus all the tributaries coming in, minus the diversions, and then plus groundwater. And of all these processes or features, the groundwater is the one we don't know. And so as long as we have values for the other 4, then we can do a very simple algebra and solve for groundwater using this water balance equation. So we are now going to apply this equation to those 3 sections of the White River as an estimate of how much groundwater is being exchanged or going into the river. So as an example, we're going to look at section 1, that's between these first and second stream flow gauges. And as you can see, there's a lot of diversions, all those black dots, but we know the flow going in, we know the flow going out. We have tributaries coming in, so Dry Creek and Miller Creek. We have diversions, those red arrows are showing water being taken out of this section of the White River. And then we have outflow that's also being measured at the stream flow gauge. And then the unaccounted for water would be what we assume would be coming from the aquifer. And again, assuming we have this gaining stream. Now, outflow and inflow we have those measurements from the USGS or DWR. Diversions also from the Division of Water Resources. And then we're using a watershed model to estimate how much flow is in those tributaries. And then we also do, again, spot checks against the measurements that Liz has provided to make sure that those flows are accurate. So now we can use this process to figure out how much groundwater is coming in. We do this for every day. So we have daily groundwater inflow for each of our 3 sections. And I now want to show some results of that water balance. So here's our 3 sections. And we're looking at from 2019 to 2024. So over a 6-year period, and I'm just going to show some averages first. So section 1, that's in this dark blue, about 40, 38 to 40 CFS is coming in from the aquifer. In section 2, it's a bit smaller of a section, so only about 20 CFS is coming in from the aquifer as groundwater discharge. And then the longer section, section 3, it's about 43 CFS. Again, these are averages over the 6-year period. So that's a total of about 100 CFS. Now, what's important is to be able to compare that to the actual river flow to know if these flow rates are significant or not. And if you look at the average flow coming at the downstream gauge, it's about 585 CFS. So of that 585, about 17%, I guess you could say about 1/5 of the river water on average is coming from the aquifer. Now there's also seasonality to this, and I want to show that now. So I'm going to show results just for section 3. So this is the gauge from near Meeker to the gauge below Meeker, those 3rd and 4th orange dots. And this is monthly groundwater flow from the aquifer into the White River. And you can see there's seasonal variation. It maximizes during the summer, but you also get a lot during the fall and winter months. And that's the flow that can sustain river flow during the winter. And we're going to come back to this a lot during the presentation, but just remember there's a seasonality and groundwater is constantly feeding the river, but at certain points of the year, it's more pronounced than others. Now, it's also helpful. This is called a point flow diagram. We're going to look at average flow at every point along the river. I think it's about a 33-mile stretch. And the map on the right is kind of showing where we're going to start, and we're starting at the upstream river gauge. So that's going to be on the chart on the left side where distance is 0. So it's distance from the upstream gauge. And the flow coming in, and this is average over 2019 and 2024, is 575 CFS. Now, as we move along this chart, whenever we come to a ditch, the flow rate's going to drop because the water is being taken out of the White River. And then when we get to a tributary, you're going to see a kind of a jump in the chart because water's coming in. And the slope between these locations is based on how much groundwater is coming into those river reaches along the length of each reach. So, for example, we're going to go to there's not a lot happening in the first 5 miles, but there is groundwater coming in. So you see this increase in flow up to about 580 CFS. And then the Miller Creek ditch is going to drop the flow by about 15 CFS, by about 30 CFS. That's how much it's taking. Miller Creek brings the flow up a little bit, but then we have Oak Ridge Park ditch, Highland Ditch, Old Agency, and Lowland, which all are taking water out. So now we're dropping to about 490 CFS after about 10 miles of the White River. And then we have a gauge, and so we know at that second gauge, the flow is about 490 CFS. And then we have a lot of groundwater coming in. We see that steep slope. And then we have some water coming in from Coal Creek. And then we have our 3rd gauge. And then again, a lot more groundwater is coming in, that steep slope. Flag Creek, bringing a little bit of water. And then we have some major ditches. So Niblock and then Powell Park are dropping that flow. Sheep Creek brings it flow up a little bit. We have another ditch. And then Strawberry Creek brings up flow. And then Hay Ditch number 2 at the very end. So the downstream gauge, we have a flow of 585 CFS. So it's very interesting that you actually have more water at the end of the river at 33 miles than at the beginning. And that's because of the groundwater coming in. And so just some very basic numbers here. You have about a 10 CFS increase in flow. Diversions are about 180 CFS, tributaries only 60, so the remainder is the groundwater coming in. And so that's about 132 CFS, again, averaged over the 6-year period. So groundwater is approximately 70% of the diversion. So of all the water that's being diverted from the White River, 70% on average is coming back into the river. So the remainder is being used by crops, which is great. But of course, we have a lot of excess water, and that eventually makes its way back to the river through this groundwater return flow. Now, if there was no groundwater discharge, so if you diverted water, but there was no mechanism to bring that aquifer, that groundwater back in the river, then river flow at the downstream would be only about 450 CFS. So again, it would drop by about 130. And again, this is just based on averages. There's also seasonality with this in the between spring, summer, fall, winter, and I'll show some results later on about how that's also very significant to assess. So that was looking at using a river water balance to figure out how much groundwater is coming in between those sections of the river. But we also want to track water to elevation. There was a very strong feeling that water tables would go up very high in the summer because of that recharge and ditch seepage, but we wanted to make sure that that's actually what was happening. And so there are 11 locations that were selected. Most of these are domestic wells where you don't, the pumping or removal for drinking water doesn't affect the water table significantly. So in each of these 11 locations, we have a data logger that's kind of shown here on the right, a hobo logger, and Liz is the one who's been supervising that work and going out and collecting and downloading the data. So this is again a shout out to Liz for all the work that she's done on this. And we are measuring water levels every hour. We started this in November 2023, and it's ongoing. So now we have, a year and a half of data, which has been really helpful to learn about the system. So I want to show results from a few of these wells. So for example, here's a well that's right along one of the ditches and right by one of the irrigated fields. And this blue line, well, let's say the black line is the ground surface. And this is looking at elevation from sea level. And then there on the bottom of the chart, you have this gray line, and that's approximately where the bedrock is located. And then the blue line is what the logger is recording as far as water table elevation. And the red dots are just taking the average monthly water table. So the blue is every hour, and the red is average of those for every month. But you can see here, this is looking at kind of the summer of 2024. In May, there's a 15-foot rise in water table, which that's a lot of water coming in to make that much rise in the water table. If you account for pore space, that's roughly 3 to 5 feet of actual water that's going into the subsurface and then causing that change in water table. Likely it's a combination of ditch seepage and irrigation recharge because we are near a ditch at this location. So you get that initial rise of 15 feet. And then interesting, you kind of see that recede over the next couple of months. And so the water table goes up and then it goes down. And that's because groundwater is flowing based on gradients flowing back to the river. So another indication of this very significant flow of groundwater in the aquifer. And then you have a second rise, and that's because there's a second diversion season in the summer after they've cut the first grass, now they're going to divert again, and you get a rise now of about 10 feet in the middle of August. And then you can also see that again recedes as you go to the fall and winter, and you pretty much get back to your water table that you had the year previous in the winter. And so you get this big influx of water, and then that water's going to go somewhere, and it's going to be flowing back to the White River. Here's another well that's a little bit farther down on the near this ditch, and you don't have quite as much rise, but you still get the, well, it's still about 15 feet and maybe 5 feet in August. So again, that rise and the recession in the fall winter months. Now, not every location has this much rise. We're going to look at one. Oh, and it's just another diagram just showing that spring and summer, that water is gonna rise, and then you get outflow as that water goes into the White River. Now, here's one over in Powell Park aquifer, and a lot of fluctuations here, but you don't see quite the same pattern. Maybe just a few feet of rise during the summer as you irrigate, and it actually drops to, the water table drops to a level before, or that's lower than what we had in the previous year. But again, we're just tracking all of these fluctuations throughout the Meeker area. All right, now I want to transition and talk about the hydrologic model. In order to run scenarios for management, we need to have a representation of the aquifer and river and irrigation systems. So you could do these what if scenarios. So what if you change from flood to sprinkler? What if a drought happened? What if you had less flow coming in because of changes in weather patterns? And so to do those scenarios, we first have to construct a model. So I want to take a few minutes and just talk about that. And first say, what is a groundwater model? Here we have a map of the agency park aquifer showing the irrigated fields. As you can see here, I've overlain, looks like a checkerboard. It's a collection of, it's a grid, and each of those individual cells is 200 feet by 200 feet. And we're using a groundwater model. We're going to track the groundwater storage and water table for each of those individual grid cells through a daily time step. And I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a bit more of those, how those cells are oriented. So we have the blue line is the White River, the red lines are ditches, the green polygons are the alluvial aquifer, and then we also have the irrigated fields. So each of these cells, we call them cells, these sections represent a section of the aquifer, like a three-dimensional system. And we're going to track, really we're just doing accounting. We're going to track how much water, groundwater, is in this section of the aquifer. So we have all the inflows and outflows. So we have recharge, we have seepage from ditches, we have exchange, if the cell is along the river, then that groundwater can be exchanged with the river. If there's a pumping well in that 200-foot section, then you can also simulate groundwater pumping. And also lateral flow, that's groundwater that moves between these sections as you have groundwater flowing from kind of up gradient to down gradient. So each of these individual grid cells represents a volume of aquifer, and we're just doing a water balance to do some accounting for cubic feet or acre feet of groundwater in each of these small sections. Zooming in here a little more to this section. So once we, on every day, we're going to be tracking how much groundwater we have in each of these individual grid cells, but also water table. And if you have, groundwater is going to flow from high water table to low water table based on energy gradients. So for example, this black arrow is showing a place where you're going to have water flow from high to low, and eventually that water is going to be flowing into the White River. So not only does it affect the gradients, which will affect discharge to the river, but the groundwater actually will be moving and going from these upper areas towards the White River. So we have constructed the model using it's a U.S. Geological Survey modeling code called MODFLOW. It's the most widely used groundwater model in the world. And as long as you feed it the right data, so geologic properties, soil properties, pumping rates, all the data that goes in there, then you can apply it to your individual study region. As I mentioned before, each cell is 200 feet by 200 feet. We run the model for the year 2019 to 2024 using daily time steps. Some of the features are listed here. We simulate ditch seepage to the aquifer along the ditches, recharge to the aquifer using a soil water balance, pumping for the Meeker wells, exchange between the aquifer and tributaries in the White River, and then we also are simulating water table elevation for each of our grid cells. Now, because the White River has some unique aspects, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, we actually developed in this project a new irrigation package that accounts for daily diversions for ditches, daily ditch seepage, daily soil water balance, so you can track crop ET versus runoff to tailwater versus deep percolation. And it's all done inside this model, and then you get output. You can make plots and charts. And so I'm going to show some of those results here. This is also can indicate that if we wanted to, we could transfer this to a different river valley, because the model's kind of set up for easy transferability to other study regions. Now, once we run the model, we have to test it to make sure it's actually working properly and represents our system. And so we're going to be testing the output with the water balance along those 3 sections of the river, water to elevation in those 11 monitoring wells. And there's also some ditch seepage studies that were done that we can make sure that we're getting the ditch seepage magnitude correct. Part of this model is you indicate the irrigation type for each field. And so each of our polygons, we indicate if it's flood or sprinkler. This map is showing, based on 2020 data from the Division of Water Resources, which fields are flood versus sprinkler. So as you can see, vast majority is flood irrigation. And a unique aspect of this is that if you have runoff from a field in an upland or up gradient ditch, it can be captured by a down gradient ditch and then reused as irrigation. So that's part of this new package we wrote for MODFLOW to make sure that that unique aspect could be handled because of all the reuse of water that happens in this region. We also want to make sure that we capture ditch seepage correctly. So all this cyan color along the ditches, those are the cells where we're simulating ditch seepage. So we're going to divert water from the river. There's going to be some ditch seepage. The remaining water can then be applied as irrigation to the fields. All right, looking at some model testing, let's first look at water to elevation. So here's one of the wells I showed before. The red dots are what we got from the logger. So that's the average monthly water to elevation that was measured. And then the blue line is what the model's giving for 2021 up through the end of 2024. As you can see, the model's capturing that seasonal increase from ditch seepage and irrigation recharge, and it's tracking the data quite well. So we're quite confident the model's getting the right water table fluctuation. Here's another well. This is on the southern parts along Miller Creek Ditch. And again, showing the fluctuation that the model is giving versus what the wells are showing in those red dots. Now, we also want to show flow patterns of groundwater. And so we have these groundwater return flows. This map here is showing the water table elevation that's provided by the model, and the red arrows are showing the direction going perpendicular to the contours of the water table. And it's interesting, we compared this to a USGS field study from 1985. They had monitoring wells, they made a map of groundwater flow. They didn't do a model, they just used the field data, but the flow patterns are very similar. So we feel like we're also getting the flow patterns and directions correct. If we look at a cross section, the black line here is the ground surface. The blue line, the dash blue line is the water table that's being simulated. And so you can see that gradient showing that groundwater that's flowing to the White River. Something else that's interesting, you could make a 3-dimensional plot of water table elevation. So it's like a water table surface map. And as you can see on the southern part, you get these high mounds of water table as all that recharge is coming in, and then that's going to flow to the White River. That's showing kind of the depressions along the channel from east to west. So kind of interesting that we're not comparing this to any data, just to show that's kind of where the water is being stored in the aquifer. Now, second, we can also compare what the model is giving to those water balance results we did for each of the 3 sections. So as you remember from section 3, this was the monthly groundwater return flow that we got from the river water balance. And I'm going to overlay on top of this the model results to show that the model is tracking that seasonality of groundwater return flows. And if you look at averages, it's doing a very good job of simulating the groundwater flowing into the White River along this section of the river. We did the same for section 1, section 2, and they look very similar. Now, those were looking at model testing, just to give some more information on how much water, kind of what volume are we talking about and how it compares between these different components of hydrology. So this is showing just for 2022 daily volumes in cubic feet. Along the top is showing rainfall, and then the yellow is diversion. So you can see those two events of diversion in the summer and then also in the fall. This black is showing ditch seepage. So roughly 15 to 20% of the water is being lost, of the ditch water is being lost to seepage. The crops are going to use the water in the soil as you irrigate. So that's showing here in green. But here in red is showing the recharge from the fields to the aquifer. And so when you add up the black and the red, that's how much of the diverted water is just going into the aquifer, and then it can make its way back to the White River. Showing this more on a conceptual basis, and I'm going to show some arrows here showing where water is moving in our system. I'm going to show some numbers, and those are 1,000 acre feet per year. And I'm going to also give thin lines for low volumes and thick lines for high volumes. And so we have rainfall coming in, that's 40,000 acre feet per year. When you add it up for the whole region, how much water is diverted from the river is 132. However, 29 of that is going to go as seepage water directly to the aquifer. A little bit of pumping. You get some runoff. However, a portion of that is going to be captured by downgradient ditches that can be reused for irrigation. And we have infiltration from rainfall and irrigation. That's 36 and 96. So again, a thicker line because that's a lot of water. ET is 50. That's what the crops are using. And then the rest is recharge that goes to the aquifer. And then you have 105 going from the aquifer into the river. So when you add up that seepage plus the recharge combined, that's going to be how much water eventually is going to make its way back to the river throughout the year. So some key takeaways here. We have something called groundwater fraction. That's the ratio of net groundwater discharge to diverted water is about 80%. Seepage is about 20% of the ditch water. If we're looking at irrigation efficiency, after you take out the seepage, it's really how much water you're applying. It's about 50%. So of all the water you apply, again, a portion of that runs off the field, but most of it recharges the aquifer. So this is a low value. However, the majority of lost water, again, recharges the aquifer and returns to the river slowly via groundwater return flow. So you're not losing the water, you're just retiming river flow. By diverting it, it goes in the aquifer and then slowly makes its way back to the river. For an average year, volumes of ditch diversion, recharge, and groundwater discharge rates are about 20% of how much water is actually in the aquifer. So every year you're kind of replenishing 20% of your groundwater storage. So the aquifer acts as this conveyor system, unused river water that goes to the soil profile, recharges the aquifer, and then returns to the river and tributaries. So if we look at a kind of average year, and I'm going to show a result here showing natural versus irrigated. Again, this is our 33 miles of the river. And again, this is average conditions. So we have that 575 coming in. If it's a natural condition, we're not going to have any ditches diverting water. We still have tributaries bring in rainfall runoff. Groundwater, the water table is a lot lower under natural conditions. So you only have 23 CFS coming back in the river, but you have a net increase because of the tributaries and groundwater, but no ditch diversions. Now let's look at flood irrigation. What's been happening for 100 years now. We saw that 575 coming in. We have a lot of ditch diversions. Tributaries is still the same, but now we have a lot more groundwater because of that unused ditch water that goes in the aquifer and goes back to the river. And so we have an outflow of 602. Again, The difference would be what's used by the crops or stored in the aquifer. Now let's just look at October through December. Again, looking at natural conditions versus floods. So natural conditions, again, a lot lower flow because it's the winter or fall winter. A little bit of coming in from tributaries, that same 23 CFS coming from groundwater. So that's kind of this, under natural conditions, that's just base flow that's coming in. And then you have 301 CFS and river outflow. Now, flood irrigation conditions, again, you're going to divert 70 CFS to ditches, and then you have 148 coming in through groundwater because you have all that water stored from irrigating during the summer and fall. That excess water is going to go into the river, and now you're going to sustain this high groundwater, this high flow during the winter because you have that high groundwater return flow. So again, just showing seasonality of what's happening. All right, Phil, I'm going to skip ahead just for the sake of time. Let me I can come back to this later if we need to, but I want to show one scenario here. So what happens if flood irrigation is changed to sprinkler? Now with flood irrigation, as we've seen, most of the water applied to the fields becomes deep percolation, and that recharges the aquifer. So if sprinkler irrigation is used with the aim of increasing irrigation efficiency, meaning you're trying to limit runoff and limit deep percolation, then less water needs to be diverted from the White River. And that's, again, that just happens. And anytime you switch from flood to sprinkler, you're going to divert less water. So what I'm going to show here is a hydrograph, the stream flow, daily stream flow at the downstream gauge below Meeker. And I'm going to show the results, kind of the historical condition with flood, and then what happens when you use a switch to sprinkler. So the black line is the baseline hydrograph, and you can see, about 300 CFS in the spring of 2022, and then it increases a lot because of snowmelt as it comes in from the upstream end of the White River, goes up to about 2,000, and then you get, of course, lower flows in the fall and winter. Now, the red line is what would happen if you divert only half of what has been diverted historically through those ditches along the White River. Again, we're assuming you don't need as much water for sprinkler, and so you're only going to divert half. So what's interesting is that more water is left in the river in the summer and the fall because you have lower ditch diversions. But then you have this trade-off that in the winter you get less water in the river because of lower groundwater return flows, because you let the water bypass in the spring and summer and didn't store it in the aquifer through flood recharge and ditch seepage. So I'm going to zoom in here to the kind of the fall winter months. And so again, you can see more water in the river under the sprinkler scenario, but less that in turn results in less water in the river in the fall winter because you have lower return flows. And so just based on the science, we feel like this is what would happen if you do those changes. And now the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? What are the trade-offs? You might have more flow, less stagnant flow in the summer, but you're not going to have quite as much flow in the winter. So that might affect fish, habitats, wetlands, downstream hydropower, and so forth. So some summary of the findings from the study. The ratio of groundwater discharge to the White River to divert water is by 80%. So of all the water you divert, you're going to get about 3/4 or 4/5 of that water is eventually going to go back to the river and be reused downstream. Region-wide irrigation efficiency about 50%. However, again, when people talk about irrigation efficiency, they assume the water's lost, but really the lost water goes to the aquifer, inducing groundwater discharge to the White River and its tributaries in post-irrigation months. The aquifer acts as a conveyor system for diverted unused river water that percolates through the soil profile, recharges the aquifer, and returns to the White River in the fall and winter months. And during the months of July and September, about 3/4 of the water in the White River is due to groundwater discharge. So if you somehow shut that off, you would have a lot less flow during those months.
So Ryan, let me just jump in and on that
Sure.
number one point, the ratio of
Yeah.
groundwater discharge to the White River. to diverted water is 80%.
Yep.
So is it fair to say that then the the actual amount that's being used represented by ET is 20%, or is it more than that?
Uh, yes, of all the diverted water, it's about 20%. That's right. Yeah, when you
Oh,
talk about after ditch seepage, how much you actually apply to the field, that's where we get that 50% number.
okay, thank you. I mean, that is just an incredibly low number, and I think it's really important to understand just how much of that gets returned back one way or another.
Yes, and so we've not done this exact same study in other valleys, but people have looked at these groundwater fractions, and the White River is unique. It seems like this is a lot, um, but the same process happens elsewhere, maybe just not to the same degree. Although other West Slope valleys might have the same number, we just don't know. We haven't done that. We haven't done those studies yet. Uh, Number five, the aquifer has a short memory, meaning that it's highly conductive. And so if you have a drought one year that affects the water table, it will recover the next year as long as diversions go back to what they were historically. I kind of I skimmed, or I skipped a slide where we talked about drought, but that is typically what happens. So during drought year, you'll have less return flow from groundwater, but the following year it will rebound very quickly. And then finally, scenarios, diverting less water will change the timing of river flow. You'll have higher flow rates in the spring and summer, but less in the fall, winter. You have that trade-off. This could have negative effects on environmental flows, habitat, wetland maintenance, and river water temperature. And also, I've shown some averages, but really it's location specific. You could see which areas might be affected more if you drop the water table, how like a wetland might be impacted, or if you have less groundwater coming in the winter. Of course, groundwater has a different temperature than surface water. You might be changing the river water temperature, which might affect fish populations. So those are our main takeaways. So Phil, I'll turn it back to you if there's any questions. Again, very interesting, I think, unique study here that we've been able to work on. Some interesting findings that we'd like to look at other valleys as well to see what's happening there as well.
Thanks, Ryan. A lot to absorb there, obviously.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
Paul starts us out with a really hard question. I'm glad you're having to answer it, not me. But do you know how many months it takes for a molecule of water that goes through deep perk to get back to the river?
I don't know that, but if you gave me 3 minutes, I could figure it out. Not right now. I could during the presentation, but yeah, we know the connectivity of the aquifer, we know the gradient. We could do a very kind of back of the envelope calculation. So I'd be happy to follow that up with you. Is that Paul who asked that?
Hmm.
Yeah, I could figure that out, find it out fairly quickly.
Would that be dependent on location?
Absolutely. Yep. So, some areas you'll have kind of a higher buildup of your water table. You have a steeper gradient of the water table, and so you'd have a lot, quicker flow than areas where it's not quite as steep. And so, something we've done in other studies is we've looked at groundwater travel times, and so every single point in the aquifer, you could figure out how long it takes for that water to get to either a tributary or the White River, and we could make some maps of that, which I think would be really interesting.
And just on that grid, just to clarify, you said it was 200 feet by 200 feet and then 200 feet vertical, so length width vertical,
Well,
or
the vertical would be from the ground source to bedrock, and that varies throughout the aquifer based on the geology. It can be 20 feet or it can be up to 80 feet,
okay.
based on how thick that sand and gravel aquifer is.
Question from Danielle. Did you look at any back-to-back drought year scenarios?
We did. We looked at consecutive droughts, and again, for those 2 years, you have, in fact, I'm going to show it since there's a question here. Uh, so this is showing how much groundwater is going into the river over the 6-year period. The black is the baseline. The blue is the consecutive droughts in 2020 and 2021. Again, those weren't drought years, but we said, well, what if those were drought years? What would have happened? And so you can see the groundwater return flow is a lot less in those 2 years, but by the next year, it rebounds to the baseline. And so you do get affected by drought, but at least it doesn't seem like it's going to affect long term. Now, we are going to be doing some more weather scenarios looking at maybe, 10, 20 years, what would happen. And also if, as Liz mentioned before, stream flow is continually decreasing in the valley, what would happen if that continues to decrease? What would happen to the kind of long-term groundwater storage, the return flow patterns? What if there's a call on the river because of that? Again, those are things we can look at with the model.
So a question from Lisa, for the scenario that cut diversions in half to simulate a sprinkler system, is that enough water in August to meet the crop consumptive use demand?
It is. And so we actually have run a lot of scenarios, if you diverted 90% of original down to 10%, and we looked at where crop ET would drop off, and it's about 30 to 40% of the original diverted water. That's when you see crop ET no longer being met. And so I don't think you'd go below that. But for 50%, it does sustain the crop demand.
Question from Leslie. The initial equations for outflow equals inflow plus tribs minus diversions plus groundwater, and the rearranged version solving for groundwater do not seem to have an ET variable. If added in, that would lower the groundwater component, or is it hidden within the other variables?
That's a great point. So you could have some evaporation off the water surface, which we don't account for. So you might get maybe have a little bit less of your estimated groundwater coming in. We haven't looked at that as far as magnitude comparisons between like evaporation to the other flows. That's a great question though. We can look at that.
So non-alluvial scenarios, deeper aquifers, is that a component here? Was that even something that you looked at, or is it just really not present?
We did not look at any confined aquifers. We just looked at the near surface unconfined or water table aquifer. So that's all we did for this one. I'm not familiar with what the geology is beneath this initial. I mean, we go down to the shale bedrock. So beneath that, I'm not sure what the geology looks like.
So how hard would it be to use the model after essentially all the work you've done in this additional, excuse me, irrigation package that you put together for this basin to now add in questions or scenarios where demand management might be used or water leases? Could you model that pretty specific to each location? Could you even model it to, right down to the ranch? Let's say you're on to take one of the big ditches. Some ranches participate, some don't in some type of a lease arrangement where they're actually not applying as much and they're letting that water go on. So you might be diverting less at the head gate. Can you actually model that?
Yeah, and we've actually started doing some of those scenarios. You could do it by ditch or by field. So in this model, there's 320 fields, and each field is flood sprinkler. You could say even drip or gated pipe. And so you could go into a text file and switch it and then run the model just for that. You can do it by field or by collection of fields. So the way we set up the file structure, it's very simple. Someone could go in and change that, run the model. By the way, the model takes 10 minutes to run for those 6 years. And something else I wanted to show here is if people are interested, I'm making a decision support tool for this that you can run from Excel. You could change irrigation type for each field. You could change ditch diversions. You could change precipitation, and then you could run the model, hit a button. It will run the model externally, and when it's done, you can hit another button, and it will bring in the results and make charts and graphs for you so you could compare between scenarios. So this is just the last few weeks I've been working on this. It is working now, and so if people are interested, this might be something they could. I'm happy to work with them and show them how to use it. So you could do your own scenarios.
So that really is only just an Excel kind of a product. There's no modeling experience needed to be able to run that decision support tool.
Nope, just Excel. Yep. As long as you know the kind of the assumptions of what you're, if you change a field from flood to sprinkler, uh, that's all that would take. So the spreadsheet has different tabs, like it lists all the fields. You change the irrigation type, then you can run the model and look at the result of that.
Okay.
Trying to make it user friendly. Yeah,
Yeah, that sounds really cool. And that's something we'll be happy when that's ready for prime time to post that, Ryan, on our website or link to it.
okay.
And I would add, just for everyone's knowledge, if you want to read this, the published results of this study, they are available through the Journal of Hydrology. So you can just Google Ryan Bailey, White River Journal of Hydrology, and that'll come up. You can also go to our website, agwaternetwork.org, and we've got that posted there. And along with that, when this recording is spooled up, we'll post this webinar, and I'll put together a highlights document that will kind of go over some of the high points that Ryan's covered. Was there anything else, Ryan, that you wanted to add before we kind of wrap up?
I would say that first initial paper just shows kind of the baseline results. It doesn't show any scenarios. So we're actively working on scenarios, and that eventually we published, working with Liz and others and stakeholders on what scenarios to run, and also just interested in applying this to other valleys if people are interested in pursuing a study elsewhere. And it'd be nice to compare those results with what we're seeing here in the Meeker area. But besides that, I've just been thanks for the chance to share results here.
Yeah, fantastic job. Really interesting. It's just incredible how you have figured this out. And I know Liz has really been integral to getting all the data and
Absolutely. Yep.
helping you think through just all the scenarios that needed to be covered here. Last question here from Ben, just kind of the tail end of what he put in the chat. How will the change from flood to sprinkler impact the on-farm resources and the cost of resources per pound of yield? I'm not sure how to interpret that exactly, Ben. Ryan, maybe you have some insight on that.
I don't. I don't know that
So,
how to
I
answer
mean,
that one.
there's certainly a change in cost when you go from, wild flood or gated
Yes.
pipe to, something more advanced, more efficient, like center pivot or side roll. But yeah, I think you'd have to drill into more specific kind of a scenario where you looked at the site itself and what they were currently getting and what they might be able to. So, well, I guess with that, we'll kind of wrap up here. It's a little after 1, and we try to be kind of punctual with these webinars. So really appreciate everybody joining us. And special thanks to our speakers, Liz Chandler and Professor Ryan Bailey. Greatly appreciate hearing about all this groundbreaking information. If anyone has any questions, comments, feel free to email me at that email, phil@brinking.biz. And again, our website is agwaternetwork.org, and we'll have that as soon as it's available. We'll have that recording up and the highlights, as well as a link to that Journal of Hydrology publication that covers this whole study. So with that, we will conclude. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good afternoon.